And the reason I think that comes as a surprise, as it did to me at the time. I mean, I had the conventional liberals' view of the CIA as a right-wing incendiary group, and I was amazed to discover that this was far from the case, that they were enlightened, liberal, nonpartisan activists of the sort who characterized the Kennedy administration, for instance.
You have not been working now for the CIA since 1962. You still criticize. You were down recently in Washington?
Yes, when the story broke that I had once been, that I have for 4 years been a Central Intelligence agent, I was demonstrating outside the Pentagon underneath Mr. McNamara's office against bombing in Vietnam. And this didn't precisely fit with the image of a CIA agent, but then neither does the CIA.
Gloria Steinem, activist who sees the CIA as a sort of enlightened pal or rich uncle, quietly bankrolling worthy projects. There is another viewpoint. The young man who sprang the leak that led to the Rampart's disclosure is Philip Sherburne. He learned the secret while an NSA vice president, then won the presidency last year, determined, he says, to break the CIA connection. In his first television interview, Philip Sherburne recounts the circumstances of his first being made witty, NSA jargon for those who knew the CIA secret.
President of the NSA in 1965, while I was National Affairs Vice President, asked me to go to Washington with him to look at some potential sites for a building for NSA's expected move to Washington, D.C. And that was in May of '65. We went to a motel to meet with 2 former NSA people who were going to give us some assistance in looking for a building site in Washington. And after some discussion, the president of the association at that time excused himself, and I then was alone with the 2 former officers, staff persons from NSA. And we discussed the financial situation of NSA for a brief while, and then they told me that there were some things that I should know about the finances of NSA and its history, which I was not aware of at that time, and that I needed to know in order to fulfill my functions properly within the organization. And at that time, one of them reached into his pocket and pulled out a security agreement and gave it to me, and I read it, and they asked me to sign it in order that they might tell me the story which I had not yet heard. And so I told them that I really didn't want to sign that agreement, and they said that it was really no problem, that most of the people, officers of NSA, had signed it in the past, and that they really did need to tell me something which I didn't know. And so I signed the agreement, and then they said that there had been an amicable relationship between the government and NSA for a long time, and that NSA had really survived and been able to grow and expand its international program only by the good graces of the federal government, and in particular the Central Intelligence Agency. And then I was very sick and disgusted, and I didn't even want to see the president, who was a good friend of mine, when he came back into the room, and it felt betrayed.
I think that Senator Jackson called it, if we hadn't gone along, in the climate of the time, in the effort to get some kind of a force to combat the student forces of the communist bloc, that we would have, I think he called it unilateral political disarmament. Is there no truth? Is there no truth in what he says?
And the first argument that Congress would never have approved that sort of support, that seems to me to indicate that those people who felt that this was the right sort of approach overseas were not willing to make a public debate or go to the Congress or to the people in order to try and get support for this kind of a program overseas. That seems to me in the long run to be an extremely detrimental policy to the government of the United States.
Now let's move a good deal further ahead. When they knew all about what you knew and what you were about to say, what did the CIA do to try to keep you from talking?
Well, of course, there's a first means, I suppose, of keeping
you from talking.
Well, of course, there's a first means, I suppose, of keeping you from talking, and that is that if you've signed a security agreement, you're aware that the public disclosure of classified information is a violation of the National Security Act, and such a violation can be met with criminal prosecution. The other pressures were primarily persuasion, simply discussing in great detail what kinds of consequences would flow to other individuals, other organizations, students overseas as a result of the allegations being confirmed.
There has been talk of changing students' draft status, of forging students' psychiatric records. To your certain knowledge, is there any truth in that?
To my knowledge, that is untrue, and I think is a projection of some people's image of what they think the agency is and the kinds of things that it might likely do to people.
The story began with students, but then it spread until what became astonishing was the sheer diversity of CIA's interests. Its funds were traced to the National Council of Churches, to book publisher Frederick Prager, to half a dozen colleges. And then came what may be the biggest involvement of all, organized labor. George Meany insists his AFL-CIO hasn't taken one thin dime from the CIA, but some individual unions were taking. The American Newspaper Guild, as you saw at the beginning of this broadcast, denied that it knowingly received CIA money. But $1 million flowed to it through such conduits as the Granary Fund. The Retail Clerks Union apparently got CIA funds. And the most startling story of all concerns a Latin American revolution. British Guiana, 1963, under the far-left, rabidly anti-U.S. regime of Chetty Jagan. A series of strikes, then riots, pitched battles in the streets, ultimately the downfall of the Jagan government, its replacement by a regime more friendly to Washington. Helping to organize those strikes, 2 CIA men actually operating out of the Washington headquarters of the American Federation of State, County, and Municipal Employees. The labor operation, which yielded perhaps the most questionable result, was CIA's funding in the Dominican Republic of the Institute of International Labor Research. Its chairman, socialist Norman Thomas. On the board, Supreme Court Justice William Douglas, from whom we'll hear later. Both Mr. Thomas and Justice Douglas now insist they had no idea of the CIA connection. What caused the uproar, however, is that CIA apparently wound up financing a propaganda attack on United States policy. Richard Threlkeld asked Norman Thomas about the incident.
Mr. Thomas, what was the Institute in Santo Domingo, and what did it do?
The Institute was an educational venture which was trying to expand itself. It was primarily intended to take earnest young men who had had no experience and no education that would make them good people for secretaries of cooperatives, of labor unions, and what have you.
You think the CIA got a fair return for the money it put into your project?
Well, I don't know what the CIA could do. You'd have to ask them. I tell you that I kept getting reports up here in the United States from Santo Domingo that the CIA was working against us all the time on the field. And that's what made me the more surprised. I tell you, our man had to hide out as a suspected communist for a day or two.
You mentioned a pamphlet that you put out with, in effect, CIA money.
Well, I suppose it was CIA money. It was certainly what was the residue of the money that we got from the capital fund. Well, we did have some thousands left, and by this time, the United States had intervened in Santo Domingo, a thing to which we were opposed. And I got out a pamphlet collecting various newspaper and other articles in a very strong attack on our intervention. And we had enough money to circulate that to Congress and the newspapers throughout the United States pretty generally. It was a kind of an ironic thing. When we did it, I still wasn't sure it was, I didn't think that was necessarily CIA. I thought it was, Kaplan Fund money.
Were you
but I'd rather take satisfaction that it was CIA money.
We'll be back in a moment with the story of a CIA operation which may have used you as its cover.